The Soldier Who Never Left, an apparition that haunts an army base. Have you ever heard about soldiers encountering creatures they couldn't explain during the war? Maybe you think it's just a myth, something whispered around campfires to keep soldiers entertained or to frighten those brave enough to venture into the dark. But what if it was true? What if something inexplicable really happened? Something that continues to haunt the memories of those who witnessed it. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that has baffled experts and kept people on edge for decades. A story that begins with a single soldier and a base that would never be the same again. It was late at night, the kind of night where the air feels thick and the shadows seem to breathe on their own. A small army base, nestled in the remote corners of a forgotten corner of the world, had long been the home of soldiers, most of whom thought they were stationed there for a simple job, a simple assignment. But on one night, everything changed. The soldiers stationed there, exhausted and worn from weeks of tension, found themselves facing something that should not have existed. There was no warning, no sign, just sudden, eerie silence. The night air was cold, unnaturally cold, and for reasons none of them could understand, their bodies were flooded with an overwhelming sense of unease. And then, it started. A strange, almost imperceptible noise, the softest of footsteps echoing across the abandoned hallways. No one could explain it. At first it was just a whisper, but then it grew louder, closer, until it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was an undeniable presence, and before they could react, there was a sudden flash of light. But this light wasn't like any they had ever seen. The soldiers rushed to the window, their hearts pounding in their chests. What they saw, well, it wasn't something they could explain. A figure standing at the edge of the camp, bathed in a strange, unnatural glow. At first they thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps the result of exhaustion playing tricks on their minds. But this figure didn't move like any human they had ever seen. No, it was as if it was floating, silent, still, and then, just like that, it was gone. Vanished into thin air. The next morning, the squad was in chaos. No one could explain what they had seen. What had happened? Was it a figment of their collective imagination? Or had they just witnessed something far beyond their understanding? But what truly set this event apart was the fact that only one soldier survived to tell the tale. Everyone else was either found dead under strange circumstances or never found at all. This soldier, the sole survivor, swore never to speak of it again. But what if there was more to his silence than just fear? What if there was something deeper at play here? Do souls from the past really exist? What did that soldier see that night? What is still haunting? The base today? Stick around, because we're about to unravel a mystery that will send chills down your spine, and I promise, you won't believe what we uncover. Now, imagine this. You're sitting in your barracks, trying to forget about the war outside. But then, something catches your eye. A flash of light. Just a shimmer in the corner of your vision. At first you tell yourself it's nothing, just the reflection off the old, rusted equipment. But then, it happens again. A figure moving just outside the window. No one else seems to notice, and you start to doubt yourself. Did I really see that? The next day, strange sounds echo through the empty halls. Faint tapping, footsteps. But when you look around, there's no one there. Could it be another soldier playing a prank? But when you check, the halls are empty. Nothing but shadows creeping along the walls. For weeks, these odd occurrences continue. A sudden chill in the air that no one can explain. Shadows moving when no one is around. It wasn't just one soldier who noticed. It was everyone. but no one dared to speak up. The tension was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Every night it grew worse. And then came the strange markings. They began to appear on the ground, outside the barracks, in the dirt, as if scratched there by something. Or someone. Odd symbols, unfamiliar in design, as if they didn't belong to this world. The soldiers debated endlessly. Was it just random marks? Perhaps the wind or a trick of the light? But things only grew stranger. One evening, a soldier wandered outside, determined to investigate the markings. He never returned. His comrades went out searching, only to find his flashlight abandoned, flickering on the ground. The search continued through the night, but they found nothing. The soldier was never seen again. It wasn't long before another strange phenomenon occurred. A ghostly figure, this time visible to several of the soldiers, stood motionless on the edge of the base, watching them. Unlike the first, this one didn't disappear. It just stood there, silent, watching, unblinking, as if waiting for something. The feeling that something was wrong persisted. The soldiers couldn't shake it. It was like an invisible force was surrounding them, lurking in the shadows, watching their every move. Fear began to take hold, and yet no one could bring themselves to speak the words aloud. What if they were haunted? This still can't be explained. But there's a theory that says it's related to a phenomenon we've never understood. Is there something supernatural tied to this place? Or is there a darker force at work, something that the military tried to bury long ago? Keep watching, because the deeper we dig, the more questions arise. And trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. You've heard the whispers, the strange events that haunted that army base. But what if I told you that there was one man who saw it all, who lived through the terrifying events and emerged from the madness, alive? Only he wasn't the same man anymore. The survivor, a soldier named Michael Harris, was a quiet man. Before that night, he had been just another face among the countless soldiers stationed at that forgotten base. But after that night, Michael was no longer the same. He kept to himself, his once warm eyes now cold and distant. When he spoke, it was only in fragments, only when absolutely necessary. But the strange thing was, no one could get him to talk about what happened. He'd just shake his head and mutter, "I'm not ready to say, not yet." The silence was deafening, almost as if he were carrying a secret too heavy to bear. And no matter how hard they tried, no one could get him to open up. His few words about the experience were cryptic, like pieces of a shattered puzzle that didn't seem to fit. But what they did manage to piece together made everyone's blood run cold. You see, Michael wasn't just a survivor of the events that took place on that base. He had witnessed something otherworldly, something he couldn't describe. And the more time passed, the less willing he was to speak about it. Until one day, after years of silence, Michael was cornered. It happened during a rare reunion between the surviving soldiers. Most of them had long since gone their separate ways, unable to return to the place where they had lost so much. But Michael remained. It was as if the army base had its claws deep within him, pulling him back like a moth to a flame. During the reunion, one of the soldiers finally asked, "Michael, you're the only one left. What happened that night?" For the first time in years, Michael looked up. His eyes, filled with pain, locked onto the man who asked the question. He didn't say anything at first. His lips trembled, as if he were fighting to keep the words inside. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "There was something in the darkness. Something we didn't see at first. It wasn't human, and it wasn't alive." He paused, his face twisting in something akin to fear. "I don't know how to explain it. I don't even think I want to." And with that, The silence returned. Michael didn't elaborate further. He couldn't. The words, whatever they were locked away in his mind, too terrifying to release. But the look in his eyes spoke volumes. There was something on that base, something so dark and unnatural that it had changed him forever. His story didn't match up with the official report, and that's where the mystery deepened. No one else could confirm what Michael said. None of the others who survived ever spoke up. Some had left the military altogether, unable to cope with what they'd seen. Others had disappeared, their names lost to history. But Michael had stayed. Maybe he felt obligated to tell the truth, or maybe he was simply unable to run from the past. Either way, he was the only one left to carry the burden. His story didn't end there. As he spoke, fragments of his memory returned, images, flashes of moments he had long buried, each one more disturbing than the last. As he relived those moments, it became clear to the others. There were things that didn't belong in this world, and whatever had happened on that base was no accident. We'll never know everything Michael experienced, but his tale leaves us with one lingering question. What if it wasn't just him? What if more than one person saw what he saw, but they were too afraid to speak out? As Michael sat back, his face a mask of anguish, he looked around the room. "We were never meant to leave that night. We didn't escape." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, and the question remained. What did they escape? And what are they still running from? It's one thing to hear about strange events. It's another to experience them for yourself. But imagine being trapped in a situation where you can't explain what's happening, and no one around you can either. That's exactly what happened to the soldiers who remained at that base, and it was only the beginning. The strange occurrences started innocently enough. A cold breeze sweeping through a closed room, the sound of whispers in the night, but then the events grew bolder, more intense. They couldn't just brush them off anymore. Things were happening that couldn't be rationalized, no matter how hard they tried. One evening, as the soldiers gathered in the mess hall, something moved in the corner of the room. At first, it was nothing, just a flicker of movement out of the corner of their eyes. But then it happened again, and again. A shadow, unlike any cast by the lights. It was wrong. It didn't belong. A brave few soldiers went to investigate, but the moment they stepped into the hallway, the air seemed to shift. It became thick, like the very atmosphere was alive, pulling at their chests, making it harder to breathe. One by one, the soldiers froze. They couldn't explain it. The hallway stretched out in front of them, but it didn't feel real. It was like walking through a dream or a nightmare. The first soldier who stepped forward screamed and ran. He was never seen again. The others, paralyzed by fear, could only watch in horror. What was happening? Where had he gone? How could they explain this? They couldn't. They were caught in something beyond their control. And then the sounds began. Strange noises echoing throughout the base, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. The walls began to creak and groan, as though something ancient was awakening. It was clear to the soldiers now. This wasn't just a bad dream. Something was waking up. As if on cue, they all felt it, a presence, cold and unyielding, closing in on them. There was no escape, no safe place. Every corner seemed to hide something else, something waiting for them to get too close. And then came the worst part. The vision. The soldiers, standing in the center of the base, turned to look at one another. They weren't alone anymore. Shapes, figures, shadows, all around them, slowly closing in. Unseen eyes watching from every direction. No one said a word. They didn't need to. The truth was clear. Whatever was haunting that base was closing in. It was real. What had started as an inexplicable event had become an unrelenting terror. And now the soldiers had no choice but to face the question. Could they survive this? It's often said that the past holds the key to understanding the present. But what if the past is too terrifying to face? What if the memories of those who came before you carry secrets so dark, so twisted, that they shouldn't be uncovered? This is the story of how the soldiers at the base learned that sometimes the dead don't rest. And those who come face to face with the past are left with scars that never heal. As the events on the base grew more bizarre and frightening, Michael, the only survivor who had dared to speak, began to share pieces of his past, fragments of a memory long buried. It was only after relentless questioning that he finally opened up about a part of his experience that still haunted him, even after all these years. There was something strange about that place, Michael began, his voice trembling as he recounted the events. Before we were stationed there, before we knew what was happening, there were rumors, whispers about the land. But no one talked about it openly. They told us the base was built on old military grounds and that the previous soldiers had disappeared. I didn't believe them at first. But then, he paused, as if reliving the horror of that realization all over again. He leaned forward, his eyes dark with the weight of what he was about to say. We found something. Deep in the woods near the base, there was a hidden bunker, an old facility that had been abandoned for years. It wasn't on the maps, and it shouldn't have been there at all. The soldiers had stumbled upon it by accident, curiosity driving them, as it often does with young soldiers eager to explore. But once they stepped inside, something in the air changed. The bunker was old, but not like the rest of the military installations they had seen. This place was different. There were strange symbols etched into the walls. Dust-covered books stacked haphazardly. The eerie silence within the bunker felt wrong, as if it had been untouched by human hands for far too long. But the worst part, Michael explained, was what they found inside. In the center of the room, beneath the crumbling ceiling, lay an object, an artifact of some kind. It was an ancient-looking relic, not something military-grade or designed for war. It was a small stone, statue, unmarked and covered in a dark, oily substance. What struck me was the eyes, Michael said, shivering as he recalled the memory. Those eyes, they weren't right. They glowed, faintly, like they were alive, and the moment I touched it, his voice faltered, and he looked away. That's when everything changed. No one could explain what happened after that. The soldiers who had touched the artifact began to act differently. Their moods soured. Their thoughts became clouded. It was as if the base, the land itself, had claimed them, twisted their minds. They started seeing things, strange shapes in the shadows, voices that whispered in their ears when no one else was around. Their nights were plagued by dreams of a war that never ended, of soldiers marching, of fire and blood. That was when they realized. The artifact wasn't just an object. It was a link, a connection to something far darker than they could imagine. And the land around them, it was cursed. The soldiers were not just experiencing the supernatural, they were being manipulated by an ancient force tied to the land itself. Michael's face grew even more somber as he recalled the final moment that would change everything. The night we found it, that's when the spirits came. At first they were just shadows, but then they began to speak. His voice dropped to a whisper. And they told us we were not welcome, that we had disturbed something that should never have been disturbed. The other soldiers who had witnessed these horrors were too frightened to speak, afraid that talking about it would only bring more of the spirits into their lives. But Michael, he couldn't escape. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was haunting them was linked to the base's dark past. The truth was now clear. The strange phenomena, the terrifying visions, and the unexplained deaths weren't just random. They were the result of a forgotten history, an ancient evil that had been awakened once again by the soldiers' mere presence on that cursed ground. This revelation made it even clearer that something sinister had been lying in wait for years. But why? What was the purpose of the spirits? And how were they tied to the soldiers who had come to occupy this forsaken place? The soldiers were left to wonder. Had they stumbled upon something they couldn't undo? Something so powerful that even the most experienced military minds couldn't fathom? As Michael sat in silence, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. But there was one question that still lingered in the air, one question that no one dared to ask, not aloud. What had they truly unleashed? Part 6. Increasing tension. Strange appearances. What happens when you cross the line between the known and the unknown? When the walls of reality begin to crack, revealing a world that shouldn't exist? The soldiers at the base were about to find out. It was one of those nights when the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the base, turning the landscape into an eerie, twisted silhouette. The soldiers had grown used to the strange happenings by now, but tonight was different. Tonight, something was coming. It started slowly, with a low hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath their feet. Some thought it was the wind, others dismissed it as equipment malfunctioning. But as the hum grew louder, more intense, the hairs on the backs of their necks began to rise. It wasn't just sound. It was feeling. Something was in the air. Something tangible, like a pressure building up, threatening to explode. And then, they saw it. The first figure appeared on the horizon, bathed in the same strange light that had haunted them from the start. At first it seemed like a soldier, a figure in full military gear. But as it grew closer, the soldiers realized something was wrong. The figure was moving. Wrong. It didn't walk like a human. Its movements were jerky, almost unnatural, and the closer it came, the more it became clear. This was no soldier. The figure was translucent, like a ghost, its face twisted in agony. But the worst part was its eyes, black, empty voids that seemed to stare into the very soul of anyone who looked at it. It was as if this creature, this apparition, was trying to pull them into its world, a world where the rules of time and space no longer applied. The soldiers froze, unable to move, unable to speak. They could only watch as the figure drifted closer, its unnatural presence making the ground beneath them tremble. It stopped just short of them, and for a long, terrible moment, the soldiers could only stare into those empty eyes. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness. No sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the night. But the terror didn't end there. Over the next few days, more figures appeared, each one more terrifying than the last. Some looked like soldiers, others like twisted, nightmarish creatures, their forms too distorted to recognize. Each one brought with it an unexplainable chill, a sense of dread that was impossible to shake. The base had become a place of haunting, and it wasn't just the soldiers seeing these things anymore. Even the officers, who had long dismissed the strange occurrences as mere superstition, began to see them too. Something had changed. Something had crossed over from the past, something that had never been meant to return. As the days passed, the strange appearances grew more frequent, more aggressive. It was as if the spirits of the past were demanding answers, demanding that the soldiers face the horrors they had unleashed. The tension was palpable. The soldiers could feel it in the air, like a storm ready to break. And as each new night fell, they wondered, would they survive the next encounter? Sometimes the truth is hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But what happens when the truth is elusive? When all the evidence points in multiple directions, but nothing seems to make sense? The soldiers at the base were on the brink of madness, struggling to piece together the puzzle, but the more they uncovered, the less certain they became. The strange appearances didn't stop, and neither did the mounting fear. The soldiers had grown used to the whispers, the dark shapes in the corners of their vision, and the eerie presence that seemed to follow them wherever they went. But they knew they couldn't go on like this forever. They had to find an explanation. They had to understand what was happening, even if the answers were more terrifying than they could imagine. The first clue came when a small group of soldiers ventured back to the bunker, the place where it had all started. They were desperate to find something, anything, that could explain the supernatural events plaguing the base. As they descended into the old, musty bunker, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The air was thick, oppressive, like it had been waiting for them to return. They searched the bunker from top to bottom, but this time they found something different. A hidden compartment behind a loose brick in the wall. Inside was a weathered journal, its pages yellowed and torn with age. The handwriting inside was strange, cryptic. Whoever had written it had clearly been trying to make sense of the same horrors the soldiers were facing. The journal's author spoke of visions, of lost souls, and of dark forces that had taken root in the base. The final entry, written in a frantic scrawl, was chilling. We awoke them. They were never meant to be disturbed. They will return for us all. If you find this, run. It was the same warning Michael had given all those years ago, but this time it wasn't just a story. This time it was evidence. The journal confirmed that the supernatural events were tied to the artifact, the strange object that the soldiers had found, the one with the glowing eyes. The object wasn't just a relic of the past, it was the key to unlocking something much darker. The soldiers realized that the artifacts they had stumbled upon were not mere objects of curiosity. They were anchors, a way for the spirits, the lost soldiers, and the dark forces tied to the land to return. Whoever had placed these artifacts there had done so with the intent of imprisoning something evil that should never have been freed. But even with this revelation, the soldiers still didn't have all the answers. There was something about the artifact, something deeper and more dangerous that they couldn't quite grasp. Was it a curse? A trap? Or something even worse? As the soldiers gathered their findings, they began to argue over the next steps. Some wanted to leave the base, to escape while they still could. Others believed they could destroy the artifact, that they could break the connection to the past and end the nightmare once and for all. But no one truly knew what would happen if they tried. Would they be able to stop the forces that had been awakened, or would their actions only make things worse? The tension among the soldiers grew. Paranoia set in. Everyone had their own theory about what was happening, but none of them could be certain. All they knew was that something had awoken on that base, something that had been lying in wait for centuries, and it wasn't going to let them go easily. The real horror, however, was that the more they tried to understand, the more they realized that their actions might have triggered something they were not prepared to face. The artifacts weren't just symbols of the past, they were portals, gateways to something far worse than they had ever imagined. And as the soldiers debated what to do next, they heard the sound that had been plaguing them from the start. A distant, unmistakable whisper, growing louder. You will never escape. It was the voices of the past, those who had died, those who had been left behind. They were speaking from beyond the grave, and the soldiers were beginning to understand that no matter what they did, the spirits were not done with them yet. It wasn't enough to have a theory. It wasn't enough to have evidence. The soldiers knew they had to act. They had to find more. Every piece of information, every scrap of evidence, might be the key to stopping the horrors that had overtaken their base. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. The investigation began with a renewed sense of urgency. The soldiers knew the artifact had to be at the heart of everything, the key to the mysterious happenings. They couldn't afford to sit idly by any longer, waiting for the next ghostly apparition or for the next strange disappearance. They had to find answers, and they had to find them now. They began to search every corner of the base, every room, every hallway, every nook and cranny that had once seemed mundane now held the potential for a hidden secret. They even ventured into the woods, hoping to uncover some trace of the forces that had begun to stir. The sounds of footsteps echoed in the darkness, but no one dared speak. Their fear had grown beyond words. One night, as they searched the old records stored in a decrepit building at the edge of the base, they found something unexpected. A letter. A single, handwritten note, signed by a name none of them recognized. The letter spoke of a secret mission, a mission that had taken place long before the soldiers were stationed at the base. It was a mission designed to contain something ancient. The letter's author claimed that the soldiers had been unknowingly sent to the site of an ancient ritual, a ritual meant to keep the forces of darkness from escaping. But the ritual had failed. The artifact, once thought to be lost, had been discovered again, and the forces it had bound had been unleashed. At the end of the letter was a chilling warning. You have one chance. Destroy the artifact, or all will be lost. It was their final chance. The soldiers had to act quickly, but as they made their way back to the bunker, a sinking feeling began to settle in. They could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on them, the unseen forces watching them. It wasn't just the artifact anymore. Something darker was at play, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. And then they heard it. The low hum again. The sound they'd come to fear. It was louder now, echoing through the walls, vibrating in the air. Something was coming. What would they find when they confronted the darkness head-on? Would they be able to destroy the artifact? Or had they already gone too far? The clock was ticking, and with each passing second, the grip of the curse tightened around them. They had no choice but to press on, deeper into the heart of the mystery. But the truth, as they would soon discover, was far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. It's one thing to face the unknown, to be terrified by things that don't make sense. But what happens when the impossible becomes real? When you're forced to confront something that shatters every understanding you have of the world around you? The soldiers at the base were about to experience that exact moment, where every rule they had ever known would be broken, and their minds would be pushed to the very edge of comprehension. As they ventured deeper into the investigation, the soldiers grew bolder. Their fear, while still present, had become a driving force, propelling them forward as if by sheer will they could uncover the truth and somehow stop the madness that had taken root on the base. They had found the letter, the journal, and now they believed they were close to the artifact. It was time to confront whatever had been hiding in the shadows. But as they made their way back to the bunker, something changed. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, as if the very ground they walked on was alive. The shadows, which once seemed to merely creep, now moved with purpose. The figures that had haunted them appeared once again, but this time there was no mistaking what they were. They were the dead, soldiers from past battles, manifestations of lost souls, trapped between worlds. At first it was just one figure, a blurry, translucent form that barely resembled a human. It was hunched over, its movements jerky and unnatural. But as it stepped closer, it became clear. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a figment of their imagination. The figure was wearing an old, tattered military uniform, its face a mask of agony, eyes hollow and dark, staring directly into the souls of the soldiers who stood before it. But the terror didn't stop there. More figures began to appear, each one emerging from the shadows, silent but for the sound of their feet scraping across the ground. These figures moved with an unnatural grace, their faces twisted in torment as if they had been forever marked by the horrors they had faced in their past lives. The soldiers tried to retreat, but it was no use. They were surrounded. The darkness had claimed them. And then the whispers began. Low, almost inaudible at first, but growing louder with each passing second, the voices began to fill the air around them. You shouldn't have come here. We never left. It's too late. You can't escape. The soldiers froze, each of them paralyzed by the realization that they were no longer alone. The past had come alive around them, and it wasn't just the figures, they were in it. This was the very thing they had awakened, the forces of death and darkness, reaching out from a time long buried. The line between the living and the dead had become irreversibly blurred. One of the soldiers, desperate to understand, reached out toward the nearest figure, a man whose uniform seemed to belong to a time long before the soldiers were stationed there. The figure didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, it raised a hand, its fingers curling around the soldier's wrist with a coldness so intense it burned. The soldier screamed, yanking his arm back, but the figure didn't move. The soldiers, eyes wide in horror, watched as the figure's other hand reached up to touch its face, a low, guttural sound echoing from its throat. The sound wasn't human. It was a voice from the other side, a warning, a curse, all wrapped in one. The soldier who had touched the figure fell to the ground, clutching his chest, gasping for breath as if he were drowning in the air itself. His eyes rolled back into his head, and then silence. His comrades scrambled to pull him away, but the ghostly figures had surrounded them now, closing in like a storm. Panic set in. There was no escape, no way out. The soldiers had no choice but to face it. Whatever they had awakened, whatever it was, had power beyond their understanding. The very walls of the base seemed to vibrate with energy, and the once innocent land had become a battlefield between the living and the dead. But just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished, dissipating like smoke into the night. The soldiers stood there, breathless, shaken to their core, unsure of what had just happened. Had it been real? Was it just another vision? Or had they truly come face to face with the spirits of the past? The soldier who had been touched by the figure was never the same again. His eyes had lost their warmth, and his once strong frame seemed to shrink with the weight of something invisible, something he couldn't shake. The others, too, felt it, the lingering presence, the feeling that they had crossed a line that could never be undone. But the question remained. Why had they appeared? What were these spirits trying to tell them? And more importantly, what did they want from the soldiers? The answers, it seemed, were out of reach for now. But the soldiers knew one thing for certain. Their time on the base was running out. They couldn't stay here forever. If they didn't act soon, they would all fall prey to the darkness that had been unleashed. The whispers didn't stop. And neither did the horrors. The soldiers were trapped. There was no denying it anymore. Whatever had been awakened on that base was far stronger than they had anticipated, and no amount of willpower or courage could change the fact that they were now playing a game with forces they didn't understand. Forces that had no mercy. The once strong, determined soldiers were now becoming shadows of themselves. They weren't just afraid, they were paralyzed. Every movement felt like it took all their strength. Every step seemed like a descent into madness. And no matter where they turned, they couldn't escape the oppressive feeling that the spirits of the past were closing in, pushing them deeper into a corner. The hum from before had returned. Louder now, filling the air like a steady drumbeat. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation, vibrating through their bones, rattling their very minds. And then, the lights flickered, and the bass plunged into darkness. They were alone. Or were they? The soldiers rushed to the nearest exit, but the door wouldn't open. The air was thick, like they were being smothered by something unseen. They pounded on the door, trying to break free, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the bass itself had decided to hold them in place, trapping them in this nightmare. And then the figure appeared again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a ghost. It was something other. A creature, its form shifting, fluid, as though it couldn't fully exist in this world. It reached out with tendrils of dark smoke that writhed and twisted like serpents. And with every movement, the soldiers felt their strength draining, their will to fight being sucked away. The creature's eyes locked onto them, pulling them into its gaze, and in that moment, they knew they weren't going to make it out. Not all of them. Fear flooded their minds as one soldier fell to the ground, convulsing, his face contorted in horror. Another was dragged into the shadows, vanishing without a trace. And still, the rest of the soldiers struggled to keep their footing, desperate to escape, but finding themselves unable to move. But just as it seemed like all was lost, a new realization hit them. The creature wasn't trying to kill them. It was trying to claim them. It was trying to drag them into the darkness of the past, to make them part of the curse that had once bound the base. The soldiers knew that if they didn't act fast, they would become part of the very force they had awakened. They were running out of time, and so they made a decision. The next few moments would determine whether they could escape with their lives, or whether they would become part of the nightmare that had once been sealed away. What happens next? The choice they make could either save them or destroy them all. But one thing is certain: the base will never be the same. As the soldiers huddled together in the darkness of the base, desperation began to take hold. The oppressive weight of the curse, the endless whispers, and the shadowy figures that surrounded them were closing in. Their breath quickened, and their hearts pounded with the overwhelming knowledge that time was running out. But in that moment of desperation, a thought struck them. There must be a way out. They had to find it. There had to be something they had overlooked. The chaos of the previous encounters had left them feeling powerless, but they had one thing that had kept them going. The journal. The cryptic entries they had found earlier were the only clue they had left. The soldiers knew that if they didn't unlock the final pieces of the puzzle, they would never escape the base alive. With their hearts racing, they opened the journal once again, scanning the pages for any new information, any final clues. The words seemed to blur before their eyes as they read through the final entries, their hands trembling with fear. But then, something caught their attention. A phrase. One sentence that had been repeated over and over, buried in the middle of the journal, hidden between other cryptic notes. The key lies beneath the stone. At first it didn't make sense. What stone? Where? But then, a chilling realization struck them. The stone from the bunker. The cursed artifact. That was the key. The object they had uncovered so many days ago was the focal point of everything that had happened. It wasn't just a relic. It was a doorway, a gateway to something ancient and horrifying. Without a word, The soldiers rushed toward the bunker, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls, each of them fully aware of the danger they were walking into. The tension was unbearable. As they reached the stone pedestal where the artifact had once rested, the air grew thick with a sense of dread. The shadows seemed to shift around them, moving with an almost malicious intent. The whispers grew louder, as though the spirits themselves were trying to stop them. One soldier, his face pale, stepped forward and placed his hand on the pedestal. He could feel it. An unnatural pulse, like the stone was alive, as if it were breathing under his touch. He looked around at his comrades, their faces full of fear, but also of resolve. This was it. This was their last chance. With a deep breath, he pushed the stone. Adiphobus shifted, groaning under the weight of time and the curse that had bound it for centuries. Slowly, the stone slid away, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. The soldiers held their breath, afraid of what they might find, but as the compartment opened, the answer became clear. Inside, there was a collection of objects, old military gear, tattered maps, and a key. The key was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was ancient, made of dark, tarnished metal, its design intricate and disturbing. But it was unmistakable. This was the key that had been mentioned in the journal. The key to what, they didn't know, but they were running out of time to figure it out. Without a moment's hesitation, the soldier grabbed the key, and they raced to the deepest part of the bunker, where they had seen strange markings on the walls. The key, they believed, would fit into a lock that would lead them to the final revelation. As they reached the wall, they found it. A stone door, concealed beneath layers of dust and grime. The markings on the door were the same as those found in the journal. This was the place. The final barrier between them and the truth. With trembling hands, the soldier inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open with a noise that sounded like the earth itself groaning in protest. Behind the door was a room that had been sealed away for centuries, untouched by time. And in the center of the room was the answer. What they saw there defied explanation. It was not just a relic, it was a trap. The walls of the room were covered in bloodstains, symbols, and strange runes, all drawn with the same dark ink that had filled the journal. The center of the room contained a large stone basin, cracked and chipped with age. In the basin lay what could only be described as the heart of the curse, an object black as coal, pulsing with an unnatural light. The soldiers felt its power, the same dark force that had tormented them from the moment they arrived. This was it, the source, the thing that had kept the spirits trapped and the base haunted for so long. And now, it was theirs to destroy. But as they approached, a sudden realization gripped them. If they destroyed the heart, would it end the curse? Or would it release something worse? The soldiers hesitated, their eyes meeting one another, but none of them spoke. They knew that their next move could be the difference between life and death. They had come this far, but now, with the heart of the curse in front of them, they had to make a choice. The decision to destroy the heart was made. But what followed was far more than they could have ever anticipated. The moment the stone heart was shattered, the ground beneath the soldiers trembled, as if the base itself was shaking off centuries of containment. The air turned thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had been poisoned. And then, it happened. The world seemed to break. The base, once static and trapped in time, seemed to shift and ripple, as though it was becoming something else entirely. The walls bled shadows, and the spirits that had haunted them for so long reappeared. But this time they were no longer just shadows. They were real, fully formed, and more powerful than before. The soldiers screamed, but their voices were drowned out by the deafening roar that filled the air. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, revealing the depths of the base, where nothing but darkness existed. The spirits, once trapped, were now free, and they weren't content to simply haunt. No, they had come back for something. They had come back for revenge. But amidst the chaos, one soldier, Michael Harris, the man who had witnessed the horrors from the start, stood still, staring at the destruction unfolding before him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "It's not over," he whispered. "We've only opened the door to something far worse." As the spirits poured out of the base, taking the form of terrifying creatures, the soldiers scrambled, trying to escape. But it was too late. The darkness had already taken root. And now there was no way out. The spirits had returned, not to be freed, but to claim what was theirs. And in that moment, they realized the curse had never been contained. It had only been waiting for someone foolish enough to release it. As they fought to survive, they realized that there was no escape. The spirits had returned, and the base had become their playground. The final battle had begun, and the soldiers, now trapped in a nightmare beyond comprehension, could only hope that their actions hadn't sealed the fate of everyone they held dear. The truth had been revealed. But it was a truth far darker than they could have ever imagined. And now they had to pay the price. The base had become a battleground, a place where the veil between the living and the dead had been completely torn apart. The soldiers, once united by their mission, now found themselves scattered, desperate, fighting to survive against an overwhelming force that they could no longer understand. What had once been a simple assignment had become a nightmare, a waking horror from which there seemed to be no escape. As the spirits of the past surged forward, manifesting in forms more twisted and terrifying than any of them had imagined, the soldiers realized that the destruction of the heart had not freed them. No, it had opened the floodgates, releasing something far worse than they could ever have prepared for. Michael Harris, the survivor, the man who had lived through it all, stood at the center of the chaos, his eyes wide with terror and realization. He had known the truth all along, but now, standing at the heart of the base as the spirits raged around him, the truth felt like a weight he could no longer bear. The spirits had never been contained. They had only been waiting for someone, anyone, to break the seal. And in their wake, they had left nothing but destruction, a wave of vengeance that none of the soldiers could have predicted. "We should have never come here," Michael muttered, his voice lost in the roar of the spirits. He turned to face his comrades, his face twisted in anguish. "We're not here to stop it. We're just part of the game." The soldiers who had been fighting valiantly, their last bits of strength pouring into the battle, looked back at him, fear creeping into their eyes. They had no answers, no way to stop the force they were facing. They had thought the heart was the key to ending everything, but instead, it had been the key to unlocking the door to their destruction. In the distance, the spirits converged around a towering figure, an ancient presence that seemed to command the others with an eerie authority. This figure was unlike the others. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a ghostly apparition. No, this was something older, something far more powerful. Its form shifted between the human and the monstrous, a grotesque amalgamation of the past, a being that had existed long before the base was ever constructed. The soldiers couldn't even comprehend its true shape, for it seemed to flicker and distort with every blink. But one thing was clear. It was the source. The force that had been controlling the spirits, binding them to this place, had manifested. And now, it was hungry. "We have to stop it," Michael said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of ghostly wails and the sound of the base crumbling under the pressure of the supernatural forces. "But I don't know if we can." The soldiers were now running on sheer adrenaline. Their weapons were useless against the spirits. They had no means to fight what they couldn't touch, what they couldn't see. They were forced to face the truth. This wasn't a battle they could win through force. This was something more primal, more ancient. And in that realization, a terrifying thought crept into their minds. What if they were never meant to escape? As the ancient figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming, the soldiers knew they had only one option left. They had to destroy the source. The heart, the relic, the very thing that had been the catalyst for everything that had happened had to be destroyed. They couldn't afford to fail. But there was a catch. The artifact wasn't just a source of power for the spirits, it was the anchor for the base's curse. If they destroyed it, they would break the chains holding the spirits in this place. If they destroyed it, they would sever the bond between the living and the dead. But at what cost? "There's no other choice," Michael whispered. "It ends now, or we all die here." But even as he spoke, he knew there was no guarantee. There was no certainty that this final act would free them. All they had left was hope, and hope was a fragile thing. The soldiers made their way toward the heart, their hearts pounding in their chests as they watched the spirits draw closer. The base itself seemed to shift beneath their feet, as though it was fighting them, trying to pull them back into its clutches. But Michael pushed forward, the rest of the soldiers following closely behind. They had no choice now but to trust in what little they understood. They reached the stone basin where the heart lay. It pulsed with a dark, ominous glow, as though it were alive, breathing. Michael grabbed the heart with both hands, feeling the cold, metallic surface beneath his palms. He had no idea how to destroy it. He had no idea what would happen if he tried. But he couldn't hesitate. Not now. He raised the heart above his head, ready to crush it with every ounce of strength he had left. And then, something unexpected happened. The ancient figure, the source of the curse, screamed. It was a sound like nothing the soldiers had ever heard, a primal, bone-rattling cry that seemed to echo through the very fabric of reality itself. The base trembled violently, and the spirits screamed in unison. It was as though the very world was breaking apart. Michael froze, his hand still gripping the heart. Something was happening. Something terrible. The energy in the air was electric, crackling with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He could feel it, the pull of the spirits, their desire to keep the curse alive. The heart was more than just a physical object. It was the core of the base's power. And in that moment, Michael understood. Destroying it wouldn't set them free. It would destroy everything. The spirits, the curse, the base itself. If he broke the heart, he would be breaking the very fabric of the world they knew. "Michael, don't!" one of the soldiers screamed, his voice barely audible through the roar. But it was too late. Michael's resolve had already hardened. With one final, desperate motion, Michael crushed the heart in his hands. The explosion of light was blinding. The base shook violently as if the very earth itself was tearing apart. The walls cracked and split, and the air was thick with a strange electric charge. The soldiers covered their eyes, unable to see through the blinding light, but they could feel the intensity, the power, surging through the air like a storm about to break. For what felt like an eternity, everything seemed suspended in time. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The rumbling stopped. The spirits went silent. The soldiers cautiously opened their eyes, unsure of what they would find. The base, once a place of horror, was now eerily still. The walls that had once seemed to pulse with dark energy were now nothing more than crumbling ruins. The oppressive presence, the feeling of being watched, was gone. The spirits, they were gone. But there was no relief. There was no sense of triumph. Michael, his hands shaking, looked around at the wreckage. The base had been reduced to ruins, a shattered shell of what it once was. And the soldiers, those who had survived, stood there, unsure of what to do next. They had freed the spirits. They had destroyed the source. But in doing so, they had destroyed the very place that had held them captive. Was it worth it? Did they truly set the spirits free, or had they merely unleashed more chaos into the world? As the soldiers stood there in the ruins of the base, they realized one undeniable truth. The mystery had not been solved. The curse may have been broken, but the land would never be the same. And they would never be the same. They had seen things, they had faced things, and no matter how far they ran, the memories of what they had experienced would follow them. "Do you think it's really over?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice shaking. Michael looked out over the destruction, the remnants of the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't know. All he could do was walk away, knowing that some mysteries, some horrors, were never truly gone. They simply faded into the shadows, waiting for the next person to uncover them. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would be the next ones to bear witness. But for now, there was nothing left to do but walk away. And that was the truth. As the soldiers walked away from the ruins of the base, the sun began to rise over the horizon. The warmth of daylight filtered through the darkened trees, casting long shadows across the desolate land. But even as the light returned, there was no peace. There was no closure. The truth about the base, about the spirits, and the forces that had haunted them would never be fully understood. They had destroyed the artifact. They had freed the souls trapped within the base. But in doing so, they had unknowingly disturbed something older, something far more dangerous. The soldiers would return to their lives, but they would carry the weight of the nightmare with them. They knew better than anyone that some questions didn't have answers. Some horrors were best left buried. As they walked away, Michael turned one last time to look at the base, the place where everything had changed. The memories of that night would never fade. The haunting would never truly end. Do the spirits rest in peace, he wondered, or are they still waiting? Perhaps the real question was, will anyone else stumble upon the base? Will someone else make the mistake of unleashing what had been sealed away for centuries? Only time would tell. But as they walked off into the distance, they knew one thing for certain. They would never forget. And neither would you. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey. Remember, some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Stay safe, and always be careful of what you uncover. You never know what might be lurking, waiting to come back.